Could you just explain what oral history is?
So it's basically like an interview where you're getting somebody's testimony, right? You're getting somebody's experience about a particular topic. We're living in a historic moment, and politics has shifted dramatically because of this moment. What you're doing through this oral history, when you sit down and interview somebody who's been involved in these events, is you're documenting their story. And when historians and when scholars and journalists write about this moment that really is shifting the conversation, that's changing history, you're going to be a part of that conversation. So that's pretty cool. The idea for this is you're going to be conducting an oral history with somebody in your social network. So somebody you're familiar with. When you interview them, you are allowed to be familiar with them. You don't have to worry about sounding super formal. You want to be comfortable. You want them to be comfortable. So it's important that you interview somebody that you know, probably, right? A friend from school, a family member. Ideally, your interview will be at least 15 minutes. It's going to be a little more difficult right now just because of COVID. Most of you are going to be doing these interviews over the phone. But after we get through this, I believe that all of you can probably achieve that 15-minute mark. You are the architect of this interview. If you are uncomfortable asking a question, don't ask that question, right? If you find that your interviewee is uncomfortable answering a question, don't pursue it. It's okay, right? We want to get stories that people are comfortable with. We don't want to make anybody uncomfortable here.
So this is technically an interview, not an interrogation. You're not doing a police interrogation.
If your interviewee is more comfortable conducting the interview in Spanish, then conduct it in Spanish. We want the best stories out of this person. So if it's another language, that's cool. I only speak Spanish. I don't speak some other language that maybe are spoken in your household, but that's fine. Whatever language they are most comfortable in, that's the language that the interview should be done in.
Again, this is going to be part of a collection that we're starting at Gutman. You can click on this link right here, and it'll sort of show you what we've created so far, which is very small. But right now, we have a massive grant to expand this to about 100 oral histories. And so you're going to be a part of a really cool collection that documents the experiences of the community surrounding the college in historic times. All right, so now you see online, this is the Gutman Oral History Collection. We could click and listen to interviews.
Okay, Sylvia, how old are you?
You're going to be a part of this collection that we're building. And then when you click also, you could read a transcript. This makes it accessible to everybody. This is where your oral history will be stored. Your interview will be stored. And this collection is going to expand massively, like I said, in the next few months. All right, so before the interview, make sure that you figure out how you're going to record the interview. If this is just on your phone and this is a family member who lives in your household, COVID makes things complicated. There are apps on both iPhones and Androids that allow you to record very easily. If it's over the phone that you're going to be doing this interview, what most people have done is either take two phones and do the interview on speaker and record it on the second phone, or there are many apps that you could download. Some of them cost a few dollars. I don't want you guys to spend any money on this. If you can find a free app that allows you to record calls, you can do that as well. You could also set up the interview as a Zoom call and record the Zoom call like I'm doing right now. That's another way to do this. And then that's actually cooler in some ways because we get the visuals.
21st century.
25, I know, it's a crazy new world out there, Gary. It's important that you practice recording. You want to make sure whatever strategy you use works, right? And while the interview is going on, you want to make sure that it's actually recording. You don't want to waste your time having done it and then telling somebody, thank you for sharing all your deepest, darkest secrets with me. We have to do it again because I messed up the recording. That's not what you want to happen, you know? We really need them to know what they're getting into, right? They need to know this isn't just a conversation that is going to be shared between 30 people in a classroom or me and Professor Graves. This is a conversation that is going to inform future generations about what was going on. And if they're not comfortable with that, then they shouldn't be interviewed, right?
Yeah, this is going to be archived so that somebody 50 years from now or 100 years from now
or tomorrow.
will be able to, or tomorrow.
During the interview, as soon as the interview starts and as soon as you start recording, make sure that they know that you're recording the call. You tell them over the recording, by the way, I'm recording this call. You're cool with that. And then at the beginning of the conversation, I want you to go over the consent form.
This oral history project is being conducted by blank, the interviewer, a student at Gutman Community College, City University of New York. By signing the form below, you, the interviewee, have granted permission for the audio recordings, transcripts, notes, video, and photographs resulting from this interview to be gifted to a collection at City University of New York without restriction. If you, the interviewee, have granted permission to do so, the interview may become a part of an archive, and the interviews will be made available for use consistent with City University of New York's mission, regulated according to any restrictions placed on their use by you, the interviewee, and or the interviewer. So this could be somebody wants maybe not to use their name and a pseudonym. And if they do this, then throughout the interview, you would use their pseudonym or a fake name instead of their name. This may mean that somebody is comfortable with the transcript being donated, but maybe not so comfortable with the audio recording because they say something and they're using a pseudonym. If that's the case, just write it down. Make our lives easier, make your life easier. This data may be used by undergraduates, researchers, and authors in publications and presentations that aim to explain modern life in New York City to present and future generations. So currently, with some undergrads at Gutman, we are writing a book about some of these oral histories. We want to tell sort of a counter narrative to stories of New York that often center wealthy white men. And so these oral histories often can serve to do so. Well, it's certainly my preference that you donate an oral history. This will not impact your grade at all if you don't feel comfortable or the person you're interviewing doesn't feel comfortable. We do want to expand this collection. We do think your work is valuable, both in the sense of documenting a story that may not have been told about New York City, and also talking about the significance of this work. Is it useful for people your age to be documenting their own stories as history? And in what ways, or in what ways could it be useful? I, the interviewee, have read the above. The interviewer affirms that she, he, they has explained the nature and purpose of this oral history. The interviewee affirms that he, she, they has consented to the interview. The interviewer and interviewee hereby give, grant, and assign all rights, title, and interests, including copyright, of whatever kind from this information and interview to Gutman Community College, City University of New York, with the following restrictions. Again, this is where you put any restrictions that may exist. So I want you to read this at the start of your interview, just so everybody is clear about what is going to be talked about. It's important that we hear the oral consent in addition to the signed consent, which you do below. Some people might not be so interested in having this released right away, but maybe a few years down the line. And then you do have to mark the date of the interview, the full name of your name, your signature, the date, the full name of the interviewee, their signature, and the date. Please do not fake signatures. This is very obvious, and you will lose points for this, and your interview will be disqualified from being submitted to the archive. So there's a part at the bottom here. If the interviewee is under 18, please secure their signature. We're going to get rid of that because let's just not interview anybody under the age of 18.
During the interview, it's important not to be judgmental of their responses. If they say something that you don't agree with necessarily, you don't be like, what did you say? I can't believe that. Because what's going to happen if they do that, Gary?
Interview's over.
The interview's over. They're going to shut down, right? And
there's going to be an argument.
It's just, that's not what we're looking for here. We want their truth, right?
Yeah.
If they're talking about an experience with police officers and you have very strong opinions about police officers, you don't have to announce to them, you know, these are my really strong opinions about police officers, because then they're going to start telling the story in a way to make sure that you're happy. And be casual. You know this person, right? You don't have to be stiff. You don't have to like be very formal, use words that you never used before. Talk to them like you normally talk to them. If you curse, it is not a big deal. That's a way to get people to open up. You want them to be able to give the fullest version of their truth. During the interview, gives cues that you're listening, that you're not just, tuning out, right? Especially if this is over the phone, you got to tell people that you're still interested. Little sounds over the phone like or sure, or things like that give the indication that you're listening. That's helpful. Another thing that's really useful is if you have good follow-up questions. If you're asking them about what they're saying, then they know that you're listening. If you're asking them about random things that they're not saying, then they think you're not listening, right? So it's important to ask follow-up questions based on what they're saying. So when they're talking, you should be taking notes, right? You should be thinking, all right, well, that's interesting. How can I build on that? What more do I need from that? It sounds like there's a story there. If I only ask one more question, how do I get that story?
So when somebody has finished saying something or explaining something, and you see, and they might have touched on something maybe interesting or kind of interesting, it's okay to maybe follow up with that particular question or that particular comment or that particular area that they were just talking about.
It's super important. It's like it's the heart of the interview, right? You really, really, really want people to know that you're listening, and you want to build on what they're saying. Because if it's just an assortment of random questions that were predetermined beforehand, that's not useful for anybody, right? You're trying to get the best stories out of them, and the way that you do that is you're an active listener. You listen to what they say. Oh my gosh, that's really interesting. I need to follow up with that. Doesn't mean you interrupt them, right? You don't interrupt them. That's why you write it down right next to you. But you listen to what they're saying, and from what they're saying, you're coming up with new questions, new avenues to sort of question them on.
It's okay to go off on a tangent.
If the tangent is totally irrelevant to what you're trying to get at, if they start talking about their favorite ice cream flavors, let them talk, whatever, and then you redirect it back to what are we talking about, right? But if they're saying, and like I've had a history of bad encounters with the cops, and then they go on talking and talking, you go back to, could you talk to me a little bit about that history of bad encounters with the cops? I'd like some more details there. I really want to understand it. It's important to get out all the information that we're trying to get out of these questions, but you could change any of these questions. The only thing you have to not change and has to be exactly the same is this first thing. My name is Samuel Feinsary, and today I am interviewing Gary Graves in the computer. I'm in New Jersey. He's in his home in
Brooklyn, New York, the center of the universe.
I've heard of it. Today's date is Sunday, July 5th, 2020.
Professor Graves, do you give me permission to record and distribute this oral history?
And this information is useful. If anybody's uncomfortable giving any of this information, they don't have to. All right. The point is that when people in 200 years are trying to document this history, it's nice for them to sort of have some qualifiers to understand whom we're talking about. It's not necessary though. The story is what's important. All right. You could ask where they're from, right? Tell me a long story of how you or your family ended up in New York City, right? For a lot of people, certainly in our community at Gutman, it's lots of immigrant stories, right? That's an interesting conversation. Some people have come from other parts of the country. That's gonna change their perception of racism. If they're coming from the US South, there's a different version of racism in the US South. They're coming from the DR, there are different versions of racism in those places. There are different relationships between police officers and civilians in those places. We need to sort of understand where they're coming from and how they ended up in New York. All right?